My name is 𝐂𝐨𝐬𝐵𝐺𝐻, and I serve as President and CEO of the TJ Alumni Action Group. The topic of our conversation, Ending Modern Day School Segregation, is complex, multifaceted, and vitally important. But first, I'd like to recognize our sponsors. The Ending Modern Day School Segregation series is a collaborative effort of nonprofits who decided to partner in support of their joint mission for education equity throughout the Commonwealth of Virginia. This series is brought to you by anti-racist alumni of Maggie Walker Governor School, Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAJC, CASA in Action, Christopher Newport University's Center for Education, Research, and Policy, Lewis Academy Now, the Chesterfield County branch of the NAACP, the Fairfax County branch of the NAACP, NACASEC Action Fund, the Proudly Diverse Caucus, and the Thomas Jefferson Alumni Action Group. Just to provide a brief overview of the issue, the US Supreme Court found racial segregation in schools to be unconstitutional in 1954. And even while our students learn about historical struggle to desegregate schools during the civil rights era, here we are, 67 years later, with an education system that both reflects and arguably perpetuates racial inequities. A recent report found that nationally, more than half of school children are in racially concentrated school districts, and that predominantly white public schools receive approximately $23 billion more in annual state and local funding than schools with predominantly non-white student bodies, despite serving about the same number of students. At the same level, Virginia has a deeply troubling history surrounding school segregation. At the height of the civil rights movement, the state was at the forefront of massive resistance, opposing school desegregation and closing schools and even entire districts in order to not racially integrate them. And even creating more than 20 segregation academies, which were private schools that remained white only until they too were found unconstitutional in 1976. Within the classroom, we continue to face profound racial challenges, from racial gaps in education achievement and disciplinary action disproportionately taken against non-white students, to the unequal impact of COVID-19 pandemic on students of color. And these topics are all on the table this afternoon.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Johnny Finn, and I'm an associate professor of geography at Christopher Newport University. I'm here tonight to talk with Sean Perryman, Democratic candidate for Lieutenant Governor of Virginia. The topic of our conversation, Ending Modern Day School Segregation, is complex, multifaceted, and vitally important. So let me introduce our guest. Originally from Brooklyn, New York, Sean Perryman grew up between there and Manassas, Virginia. He's a first-generation college student with a bachelor's degree in political science from Baruch College and a law degree from Vanderbilt Law. He worked in private practice before taking a position on Capitol Hill as an investigator on the House Oversight and Reform Committee. He then became the youngest president of the Fairfax County NAACP. Sean, thanks so much for joining us here tonight. I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
Thank you for having me, Dr. Finn. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. So as I said before, tonight's conversation will be focused on ending modern day school segregation. So for those in the audience who might be new to this issue, could you just start by giving us a little bit of background? For you, what is modern day school segregation?
Yeah, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak to this issue. As you mentioned, when we think of segregation, usually we think of historical segregation after Brown v. Board of Ed. But now our schools are probably more segregated than ever before. Part of this is that the funding for our school systems come from property taxes, and because of that, if you live in a more well-to-do, wealthy area, your schools are considered to be better because they're better funded. And that gets into the formula issue. So this is when I think of segregation, that's where it starts. It's now, rather than de jure segregation, it's de facto. And on top of that, as you mentioned, we see the disproportionate outcomes, whether it's in grades, in punishment. This really runs the spectrum. But the other part of the segregation that I would bring up is the teachers, the educators. Here in Fairfax County, where I live, we've seen there are not enough teachers of color, specifically Black teachers. And that has been a huge problem with hiring, and has been really from Brown v. Board of Ed. We have to remember when the Brown v. Board of Ed decision happened, while it said that the schools had to integrate, it never said that the teachers that taught at Black schools had to be hired. So we saw a whole generation of educators taken out of the workforce as a result of that decision.
So before I move, since you brought up this question of a diverse teacher body as well, how can we do a better job particularly in the state of Virginia in recruiting and hiring more diverse teachers in the classroom as role models and educators for our students?
Well, we have to take on the fact that some of this is not unintentional. Some of this is not a lack of supply. In fact, GMU did a study a few years back that was a big point of my advocacy here in the county, that found that it was not a supply problem, it was a demand problem. And that when teachers were hired by Fairfax County Public Schools, which is the largest school district here in Virginia, they were often Black teachers were often put in the same schools. So essentially segregating them through the administration. So this is an issue where we have to make sure we understand what is causing it. Some of it is the lack of policies around hiring. It used to be here in Fairfax County up until about 2 years ago, until we had our advocacy effort. There was no hiring criteria or framework. If you were a principal, you had a mini fiefdom. You could essentially go outside and hire anyone you wanted. And we saw as a result of that, a very segregated and very homogenous workforce. So that is part of the issue that we see when we talk about it. But in terms of other ways that we can attract more diverse teachers, we've got to deal with the teacher pay issue. Virginia trails the rest of the country as it relates to teacher pay. So that's a huge issue. And then it's probably also an issue of where we are recruiting teachers and what we're doing to retain them. During this pandemic, we've been especially cruel, I believe, to our educators. So this is a part of the problem, but it's a multifaceted problem and one we have to address.
Right, and I'm going to want to circle back to the impact of COVID-19 and the pandemic on students and teachers in a little while. But let's kind of refocus on students for just a moment and say, I mean, one of the main purposes of teaching history is to ensure for our students that they learn from the past in order to not repeat mistakes and in order to improve society in the future. And so from your perspective, and with your experiences and with what you bring to the table, how would you encourage educators to lead conversations with their students around race and school segregation?
Yeah, I think it's the third rail, I guess, in some ways is politics, but there's also race as well. But when you approach it, I would not make any assumptions. I think what the important thing to do is sort of see what the student's perspective and what they believe to be true. A lot of times when I would lecture at the community colleges, I would talk about their understanding of what this country was, what they thought of America. And I would use examples of some of the popularized history books that we had, where we talk about what distinguished America from some of the other countries is that we never had a caste system or anything else. But when we would define what is a caste system and then break that down further and then try to understand, well, how can we say that about America given the history that we know of it? And then we would dig into that. So I think it's starting at a really basic level of understanding what is their understanding of their country, the type of politics we have here, the type of social hierarchy we have here, and then really delving into that and using that as a springboard for talking about racism and segregation and the results there that spring from
Yeah, and I can certainly see how that directly kind of ties into and implicates having a more diverse teacher body to kind of put that into effect. Thank you. So I want to talk about a couple of education policy issues, if you don't mind. First, in thinking kind of through the framework of modern day school segregation, how do you see our current challenges related to school segregation in the contemporary moment intersecting with so-called school choice in Virginia? And what do you feel like, how do you envision this movement towards increasing school choice in the state?
When you say school choice, you mean like a voucher system or something like that?
Yep.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we know during this pandemic, those with means were able to unenroll their kids in the private schools that they wanted. There's just more access to that. When we talk about the school choice thing, it's really using public dollars to supplement rich people's income in some ways, right? Because you are paying them money that should have been tax money that goes to schools. And you're saying that you can do essentially whatever you want with it. This leaves behind impoverished schools. This leaves behind any school, really, because it's relying on a certain amount of dollars to go there. And then you're putting this into a person's hands who may already have the means to pay for their kid to go to school. So school choice is really a way of undermining our public school system. And it would be done in an unequitable way just by definition, whether you're it doesn't really have a means test or anything else. It just gives the school choice the money away. So this is something that I at least would oppose.
Thank you. And then kind of on the flip side of that, in terms of siphoning money away from public schools, I want to change gears and look at kind of where money could or perhaps should be put. And I'll say that there's a large body of research that directly links early childhood education to really substantial and positive long-term economic outcomes. This has been studied across the social sciences for many decades to kind of link early childhood interventions to long-term, like I said, long-term educational outcomes. So like what from your perspective, what can we do at the state level to increase access to these early childhood educational interventions, especially for non-white communities?
Well, I think it's fairly simple. The answer to it, as part of my platform for the Lieutenant Governor, is that we need to have universal pre-K. We need to get towards some form of universal pre-K, because that is, just as you said, it's really going to dictate the outcomes of a student's life after that age level throughout their schooling. So we have to make sure that we are actually making this available. We have a lot of options as far as tax revenue to do that, both through the legalization of cannabis, we have casino money. This is all options for how do we fund universal pre-K and get more students in there. Because what we see is that when the students enter the school system, for instance, the AP program, they're judged on that as early as second grade. So we really, if they don't have that foundation, this is going to have consequences throughout the life of their K through 12 experience. So I think the answer to that is to get towards universal pre-K.
Thanks for that. And then a couple more policy related questions. And forgive me for this one. I'm a geographer, so I'm really interested in kind of how social phenomena play out differently in different places. So I think while many of the challenges, especially challenges for non-white students, are similar between rural and urban schools and school districts, there certainly are differences between rural schools and rural school districts and rural communities, and the challenges that especially, again, non-white communities face in urban schools and urban school districts. So I'm wondering if you can kind of talk a little bit about the differences in the different state interventions that might be necessary, both in a world beyond COVID and particularly in a COVID world for the next year or two, when we're still dealing with the pandemic and the aftermath. Like how this plays out differently. How do you see this playing out differently between rural school districts in Virginia and urban school districts in Virginia?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are more similarities and differences in a lot of ways, depending on which school districts you're talking about. For instance, in the rural communities, obviously, whether it's schools or elsewhere, the big issue is broadband, having that broadband infrastructure. They've been trying to solve that with hotspots and everything else, but that's a huge part of it. And then as I go on the campaign trail, I was just in the Eastern Shore. One of the other issues that they have is just a high amount of poverty in their school systems. So they're living in an area that, because of the vacation homes and everything else, the average income is boosted up, but that's not reflected in the population in the school system. So throughout Virginia, and this is just one example, we have this LCI, and the way we have the formula for funding of the schools, it may not be capturing what the school actually needs. And this becomes a huge equity issue, especially in our rural populations, like I mentioned, where they have vacation homes and others, but doesn't really reflect the actual wealth of the community. Other issues is infrastructure, just the buildings themselves. They're older and dilapidated. How do we, especially post-COVID, revitalize those communities? So these are some of the issues, but that we do see in some urban school districts as well. I think the formula we have generally in Virginia is a real challenge for getting the funds to the right schools, getting the funding that will appropriately get these schools to where they need to be. So that is a universal problem, but I think in rural Virginia, it's a particularly pronounced problem, I would say. And a lot of our rural areas, the kids themselves, they don't see where do I go except for leaving the town to find that next opportunity. So these are all parts of the issues that we have to solve. And I think it starts with infrastructure, making it so that people can stay in their hometown and everything else. But this is a definite problem in our school systems throughout the Commonwealth.
Thanks for that. So, and I think just from my own experience with two kids in Newport News public schools,
yeah,
kind of watching and observing how the school district has tried to deal with the digital divide, so to speak, in the context of the pandemic has been really interesting. And it's kind of, it has brought to bear, it has really highlighted some pretty profound inequities, in my case, in an urban school district, but I think certainly we've heard the stories, as you were alluding to, the challenges in rural areas as well. So let's switch gears a little bit and talk about discipline and disproportionate disciplinary actions on non-white students. And I want to kind of start by reflecting a little bit on my own experience. I was a high school student with a bit of a temper and a couple of run-ins with the law. And upon reflection, many years later, as I became a scholar of race and racism in the American city, I started to see how at every moment in these interactions, I was essentially given escape hatches from the criminal justice kind of bureaucracy back into, back into school, or back in kind of away from, I was kind of pushed away. And I think that's kind of, in reflecting on my own experience, that's not the experience that's shared by probably most non-white students in public schools in the US. And so I wonder if you can kind of talk about the impact on students of color of disproportionate disciplinary action. And I know you've done work on the so-called school to prison pipeline. And I don't know if you want to kind of talk about that generally, and then narrow in perhaps on some specific policies that you might kind of envision to help correct the issue.
Yeah. So, I mean, when we talk about the school to prison pipeline, it's a catchy phrase, but I don't think you fully understand what it means. And it's essentially that we have school-age children who, as you give the example of being kind of a hot-headed high schooler, mm-hmm. I know a little something about that. But you have school-age children who, they may not know how to appropriately deal with anger or any of these issues. And suddenly that immaturity, that lack of development puts them in risk of going to jail. And that will be essentially, we know how we treat our incarcerated population, or even the people who have been convicted of crime or arrested of crime. It's a scarlet letter that follows you. And so this is happening younger and younger. Part of the Fairfax County NAACP one of our efforts in the middle schools, we saw kids as young as middle school being arrested. And when we looked into the records, of course, these kids were mostly Black and Latino. And it was because they weren't, as you said, given that second chance. There was no escape hatch, right? There was sort of this zero tolerance policy. And then the thing that they were being arrested for wasn't something that you could necessarily define as a crime. It was those sort of crimes that are not soft crimes, but sort of more in between the lines of disorderly conduct. So everything, we looked at all these arrests, it was disorderly conduct. And you would look at the examples of what was disorderly conduct. And it could be anything from running in the halls to not listening and yelling or something like that. So essentially, childlike misbehavior then became a charge of disorderly conduct, which then led to an arrest, which then led to a record. And you know this, that if you are suspended or disciplined or arrested, all of these sorts of infractions lead you to be less likely to succeed, less likely to graduate. These are all issues that contribute not only to the school to prison pipeline, but also to ultimately failure in the K-12 system. So this is why this has such impact on communities of color, because they are not, just like we see in our adult criminal justice system, you're not given the benefit of the doubt. You are more likely to be policed, and you are more likely to be arrested, and you're more likely to face a harsher consequence. So these are all the realities of a racist criminal justice system. And what we are doing is extending that younger and younger, introducing that earlier into people's lives. So one of the things that is a bit controversial that I've advocated for is to get the SROs out of schools, because it's the presence of police officers that lead to those arrests. They don't make us any safer from school shootings, just statistically, they do not. And we know the populations that if you introduce a cop into the school, that will lead to a spike in arrests of Black, brown, and students with disabilities. That's pretty much true nationally. So this is why it is so important that we have counselors and not cops, and that we look at very closely in community. If you can't avoid getting those cops in the schools, which you should try to, you have to make sure your memorandum of understanding pretty much strips them of any ability to arrest kids, question kids for these misbehavior. You definitely don't want disorderly conduct charges. It really should be only in the most extreme of circumstances.
Thanks for that. And let me ask, is there, beyond getting rid of, you said, SROs, school resource officers, is there like other kind of out of the box policy changes that could be made at the state level in our schools to help to immediately start dealing with this issue?
Immediately start dealing with the issue of school to prison pipeline?
Exactly, in the disproportionate disciplinary actions against non-white populations.
I mean, like we said, we can restrict the police officers and the type of crimes that they can charge children with and juveniles with. I think disorderly conduct is pretty ambiguous. So it leads itself to overzealous police officers charging a child. I think we can also look at how we fund things. Rather than putting that funding into policing, we should be putting the funding into education, obviously the school system, but in hiring counselors, connecting rural areas that may not have enough counseling services to areas that do, or through virtual appointments. These are all things that we can get creative about in the way that we address our school system. And then teaching students how to deal with conflict management and everything else. These are all important aspects of how we tackle some of the issues that we see in our school systems.
Thanks. So I want to change gears a little bit and shift towards talking about the connections between school segregation and racial inequality in school. And you alluded to this before, which is the underlying housing segregation and the way that we both fund our schools through property taxes and the way that we then populate those schools through local zoning, through school zonings. And for background, my expertise, my specialty in geography, I focus on studying the history and ongoing impacts of housing segregation and the way that the property values are so different in neighborhoods is a direct result of the history of racial segregation in housing in this country. And so what we have is the economic inequality of, for example, housing and property values today is the direct result of racial segregation in our past. And that then immediately leads to this profound differentials in school funding between communities with high property values and thus high property tax revenues that tend to be whiter, and communities with lower property values and thus lower property tax revenue that tend to be non-white. And then we we populate our schools that way. So in terms of the connection, I know we need to be talking here mostly about education and schools, but there's a direct connection between housing segregation and housing policy at the local and state level, and school segregation and uneven and unequal racial impacts in schools. So I'm wondering if you want to kind of broaden the conversation for a moment to talk also about housing policy in as much as it relates to schools.
Yeah, I mean, as long as we're funding schools based off of where people live, housing policy is going to be a relevant part of this conversation. If you don't have low income housing in what is seen as a good school district, then you won't have usually a diverse set of, and when I say diverse, I mean diverse by income, set of students in that school district. And that's why it gets to the zoning restrictions and the not in my backyard folks who won't allow affordable housing in there. And so what you're essentially talking about is redlining, right? We've made certain neighborhoods considered to be Black or high immigrant or people of color. All of these things that were considered have been redlined into areas that are considered bad neighborhoods. And then it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy in the sense that the schools are not funded to the same extent. And then we see the results of that. So we have to rethink how we do our formulas, how we do our funding. These are all parts of what controls the destiny of a school system and a school. And so it's a big part of the history that we know of here in not only Virginia, but the United States, the segregation, the redlining, and then ultimately the segregated schools.
Thanks. And I want to kind of drill down into that, and kind of, I think as a social scientist, I focus a lot on kind of intersectionality and how like intersecting structural forces of race and racism and of kind of structural economic inequality kind of intersect to create really these kind of complex problems. And so let me preface this question by saying that the principle of separate but equal was really the legal principle that was at the core of Brown v. Board, right? And the court found that underlying principle, separate but equal, to be unconstitutional. And it strikes me in kind of thinking this through, especially it seems that we're sometimes a little bit allergic to talking about race directly in terms of racial inequality, and an easy kind of crutch is to talk about, or a shortcut around that is to talk about economic inequality. And if we can solve economic inequality, like we will kind of by default solve racial inequality. And so I want to unpack that a little bit. And because it strikes me that within our current kind of racial landscape within our schools, with so many schools that are effectively segregated by race, if in focusing directly on funding and only on funding, and I'm not saying that this is what you've advocated for at all, but I think a lot of people talk about funding rather than actually talking about race. If we start from a situation of kind of pretty profoundly racially segregated schools in this country and in this state, and then we focus only on kind of the economic side of the coin, do we risk kind of returning to kind of a separate but equal by just focusing on school funding without actually putting race and racial integration at the heart of these policy efforts?
That's an interesting question. I mean, I think we start with funding because that's so often income is a proxy for race, because they can't discriminate by race legally. So that they use these proxies. And then so if we talk about if we can get the income funding, but when I talk about funding, I'm not only talking about just giving more money to schools. I'm saying fundamentally rethinking how we fund schools. If we only fund it off of real estate, If we change that model to something that is a little bit more equitable and spreads that money more evenly, then you won't have the need for the segregated housing, right? You don't just move to the neighborhood where you know you're zoned to a good school, quote unquote. So this is kind of rethinking our whole way of funding education, which I then think would have to, by necessity, rethink the way we look at housing and people making choices. Because so often you make the home choice based on the school system or where you're going to be zoned at. If we could break that down, then we would be able to probably have a more integrated system than the one we have. But you're absolutely right. It's not talking about income and talking about economics is not necessarily a one-to-one with race. And we find that even Black people who are well-to-do, well-educated are going to experience worse health outcomes. Their job searches, everything is going to be different based on that. But if we're talking about schooling and what has traditionally been done as far as resources provided, what I'm talking about is kind of fundamentally rethinking that formula because it is so tied to the monies that are provided to school. But I do take your point.
Cool. Yeah, thanks. So I want to talk about COVID-19 now. I think if we were sitting here a year or 13 months ago, we wouldn't imagine that a year or 13 months later, we'd still be doing this over Zoom, right? And I think as somebody with two kids in public education who only last week, less than 1 week ago, returned to hybrid in-person school. They've been remote until last Thursday. And I mean, I've seen the impact of this with my own eyes on my own kids and the schools that they go to. We're not out of the woods yet in terms of the pandemic, not even close. And once the pandemic kind of resides, we still face a really long kind of hangover, for lack of a better word. And one of those places where there's going to be that kind of these ongoing residual impacts, I think, is going to be in the public schools. And I think we're going to be dealing with this for years. So from a kind of a state level policy perspective, what needs to happen to ensure that the recovery from the pandemic is equitable in terms of Virginia public schools?
Well, I hate to belabor the point about the formula, but with our rural schools especially, they're going to get hit hard under the current formula because what we've seen is an unenrollment from the schools. And if they go based on those numbers, they are going to be funded at a far lower clip than what they should be. So this is a huge issue for them. But then also when we talk about students and trying to catch up, quote unquote, to their learning and the school system and everything else, we have to think outside the box, whether that's maybe some weeks in the summer of going to school. We have to rethink how we do things. And also I want to keep in mind that the ability of virtual school, and I'm not saying we should have a fully hybrid model, that's not what I'm saying, but the ability of virtual school has been better for some students as far as accessibility. So, I mean, this is something that we should keep in mind as we go forward. But I think it's going to be taking a close look at how long the school year looks like, what sort of resources we provide to the schools based on that funding model, and then also just making sure that coming out of this, the access to technology and everything else, we have to keep some models or some parts of this that we've had during the pandemic, and then we have to rethink and reshape other parts of it. So we're going to learn how adaptable we are relatively quickly, but I do think we need to return to in-person by the fall. That's what I hope for, and I think that would be best for everyone. But then what does that mean to me in person? How many hours? Well, all of that is the stuff that we have to decide. And I don't think it can be made by just one person in the state government. I would like to see a more uniform approach. I did disagree with the regional approach that we took during this pandemic. I think we need to see a more universal approach as it comes to this issue.
So talk a little bit more about that, rather than the regional approach taken by the current governor during the pandemic. Like, how do you envision an approach that is more centralized and at the same time kind of adaptable at the local level, recognizing that there's pretty profound differences between, you know, Fairfax County, downtown Richmond, and far southwestern Virginia, right?
Yeah. So yeah, we have to recognize, but I think this is what could have been done better. There has to be more communication between our local governments. So one of the things that when I'm running for lieutenant governor, I talk to folks about is that I want to be this liaison between the states and the localities in how we go about rolling out these things, because sometimes it's done so unilaterally, but then at the same time, while it's done unilaterally, a lot of times they're kicking the can on the hard decisions and saying, you figure it out. Now, some of this is not the Commonwealth's fault. This is just like the federal government not providing enough guidance. So I think as we look at this, as we look at how do we come out of this, what I would love to see from as far as a centralized approach is the guidance. How many students do you have in a classroom? What are the safety protocols, et cetera? Providing the funding necessary for the PPE for teachers, et cetera. But what would need a local approach is kind of the implementation and how that looks. So it's really going to take coordination between the state and the localities. But I want to see that communication happen and not just the decisions being kicked down to the local government level. And I would hope as Lieutenant Governor, we could be able to help with that issue.
Thanks. So final question. Yeah. And this is, you know, moving in a totally different direction. I know you have recently strongly advocated for the renaming of public schools away from being named after Confederate generals and other individuals linked with the Confederacy, especially schools that are attended predominantly by students of color. So I wonder if you can kind of speak to why you feel that it's important, and what, if any, role or impact you feel these naming issues have on students' experiences.
Yeah. Well, I feel it's important for a lot of reasons, and it's interesting because when I first became part of the NAACP and they were taking on a renaming issue, I thought to myself, oh, we can take on more important things. But when I got involved, I saw that by being able to deny the clearly racist history of these school names, they could deny all sorts of things. The current day inequities, they were able to deny those because they could just act like this racism had no effect on our school system and the sort of unequal outcomes that we saw. And then also we have to think about what is the role of school. We send folks there, we have them pledge allegiance, we have them do certain things because we are trying to socialize them in some way. And if we are socializing them that Robert E. Lee and these sort of folks were acceptable, we are implicitly or explicitly ingraining them with certain values. In Jeb Stuart High School, they had a huge mural of Jeb Stuart with his shirt off, muscle bound and all this. And we had Black athletes. So remember a young Black woman explaining that she had to work out in front of this every day, this guy who thought that she should be chattel. And so what were we saying to those students? What were we saying their value was? What were we saying the history of the Civil War was? Really, we are making a statement about those students every day that we send them to those schools. And it was so perverse and sick to me that these school board members would defend this and not want to change those names. So I think it said something about the values of not only the school, but the community. And that's why I wanted it changed.
Great. Well, again, thank you, Sean, for joining us on this evening. Best of luck to you in the campaign, and I hope that we can talk again soon. Thanks for your time, and thanks to everyone listening tonight.
Thank you so much.
All right, take good care.